And now we continue. What? There was a new man in the bakery, and he didn't look like he was interested in tea or sweet buns. He was wearing dark purple robes past his ankles, and the hems were not dusty at all. The street sweepers do a good job once the snow is melted, but not that good. He definitely hadn't walked here. "This is Inquisitor Oberon, Mona," said Aunt Tabitha in the very careful voice she uses for customers that are being difficult. I looked at her and she made a very tiny shake of her head. A warning, obviously, but against what? "You, girl," said Inquisitor Oberon, folding his arms. "You claim to have found the body, do you not?" That was a sneaky sort of question. "I found the body when I came to work this morning, yes." "At 4 in the morning?" He looked at me over his glasses. They had tiny, fussy metal frames, the sort of glasses that a bird of prey would wear if its eyesight had started to go. "I'm a baker," I said. "I always come to work at 4 in the morning." My voice sounded weak and scared, which was no good at all. I sounded like I was apologizing for the hours that bakers keep. "That's true, your lordship," rumbled Constable Alphonse, also sounding apologetic for having the temerity to confirm my story. From the "your lordship," I knew that Inquisitor Oberon worked for the Duchess. If he'd been a member of the priesthood, he would have been "your holiness" or "your worship." But what a servant of the royal house was doing in our bakery... I mean, even if it was a murder, unless the victim was somebody really important, there was no reason for the royals to be involved. And if she was that important, why was she in our bakery? And why was she wearing mismatched socks? "You're a wizard, are you not?" Oberon growled. I sort of, I guess." I looked helplessly at Aunt Tabitha. "I mean, I can make bread rise. She's a fine baker," put in Aunt Tabitha firmly, as if this put to rest any question of guilt or innocence. "There is a taint of magic around this girl's death," said Inquisitor Oberon with such authority that it didn't occur to any of us until much later to ask how he knew, or what exactly that meant. "She was murdered here, in a bakery, known to employ a wizard. A wizard who conveniently was the one to find the body." The way he said "conveniently" made it sound like he'd been standing over the body with a bloody baguette. "But," I started laughing. I couldn't help it. This was too stupid. "I don't even know who she is. Why would I want to kill her?" "A question that we will aim to answer," said Inquisitor Oberon, pushing his glasses back up and straightening his shoulders. "Coroner, remove the body. Constables, bring the girl to the palace."
You okay?
"Yeah, I'm good." I stopped laughing. This wasn't funny anymore. The horrible clenching in my stomach was coming back again. "The palace?" asked Constable Montgomery, not questioning, I could tell, but simply surprised. "You didn't bring prisoners to the palace. You took prisoners to jail." Inquisitor Oberon sniffed, exactly like Miss Magramma does when we run out of lemon scones. "Her Grace the Duchess is concerned with what she perceives as the rash of murders by wizards. She insists on overseeing these cases herself. Constables, if you please." "But," I said. "Now wait just a minute," Aunt Tabitha said. "Oh dear," Uncle Alfred said, and despite what any of us said, I found myself pushed into a coach and driven away to the palace. The coach was dark wood and drawn by 2 large grey horses with platter-sized shoes and great soft drifts of hair around their hooves. They were really pretty. Can't say the same about the coach. It had so many curlicues and carvings and finials and gargoyles and cherubs that it looked like a mahogany wedding cake. We do wedding cake, occasionally. I hate them. It's all tiny fiddly work, and while I can magic the dough so the icing goes on smoothly, it gives me a headache. Icing is not friendly. Since I was apparently a dangerous criminal, one of the constables rode in the coach with us, possibly to protect Inquisitor Oberon. I guess he might have thought he needed protection from a 14-year-old girl because I was a magicka. People get uneasy about that sort of thing. You can't testify in court if you're a magicka unless you're holding a piece of iron, because the iron is supposed to countermand magic, even though it doesn't do anything of the sort. I mean, I use an iron skillet all the time. It's just an old superstition. Frankly, an iron skillet would be a lot more dangerous than my magic at the moment. I could at least hit Oberon with it. Now, to give credit where credit is due, Constable Alphonse looked awfully embarrassed by the whole thing. I sat miserably on the bench seat with the Inquisitor opposite me, watching me like a constipated vulture, and the constable squeezed in next to me on the bench. It would have made much more sense for me to sit next to the Inquisitor, since we were both smaller than Alphonse, but somehow that did not seem like an option. I stared at my hands. There was flour on them. There was flour on my trousers too, and sprinkled over the tops of my boots. There was flour on the constable's boots as well. No flour had adhered to the hem of the Inquisitor's robes. The robes apparently did not do flour. This was not the worst day of my life. The day when I was 7 and I'd found out that both my parents had died of the cold fever. That was the worst. But this was definitely in the running for second worst. The coach rattled through the streets. Every bump transmitted up the wheels and directly to my bones. For all the carvings, the carriage really was not well sprung. Now, there's probably a moral lesson in that, but I wasn't in the mood, so I just folded my hands together. We rumbled past the big clock tower. The clock's been stopped forever. It's a landmark. It doesn't have to be functional. Still, it couldn't have been much past 7 in the morning. 3 hours. Just 3 hours. If I were back in the bakery, I'd be almost done with the early baking, and I'd be starting on the second round. The delicate pastries, the tarts that require little individual crusts, mixing up all the stuff that needs to be chilled or settled overnight so they'd be ready for tomorrow. The bread sponges would have to be set out to trap the wild yeast. With none of that done, Aunt Tabitha would work all day. She'd still be short of bread tomorrow. Will this take long? I asked plaintively. That will depend on your guilt or innocence, said the Inquisitor in a voice that was not reassuring. I stared out the window and wondered what the Duchess was going to do to me. Everybody calls our land a kingdom, but that's just a holdover from the old days, hundreds of years ago. There's just a bunch of cities now, each with their own little government and their own army and their own laws. Nation-states, if you want to use fancy words like the priest. Some of them have kings, but they only control the city and the land around it. Our city is called Riverbraid, and it is called that because of the canals. We don't have a king. We had a bunch of dukes and a couple of earls, and I think there was a prince at some point in there. But for the last 30 years, the person in charge, that's the Duchess. The palace of the Duchess is built on a hill overlooking the city. Well, it looks like a hill. Actually, it's the remains of the former half-dozen palaces, which sank like everything else here, except for one which burned down. Because it's higher, the streets slope up, and the buildings are more expensive because their basements don't flood every spring. There are stories that underneath the palace are old catacombs that used to be old dungeons, full of the ghosts of prisoners who were forgotten when the old buildings were walled up. There are also stories that there are still people under there, who live by eating rats. But nobody really believes them. Much. Really hoped that I wouldn't have a chance to find out for myself. Chapter 4. We arrived in the courtyard of the palace, which had high stone walls and pale stone cobbles, the colour of the grey horses' coats. Inquisitor Oberon leapt out before the coach had come fully to a halt. "Bring the prisoner," I heard him say as the door swung behind him. It took me a moment to realise that by prisoner, he meant me. Probably that was pretty slow of me, but it had been an awful morning, and some part of my brain, the bit that had been laughing hysterically earlier, still couldn't get over how completely impossible this was. Me. A prisoner. I bake bread. The worst thing I'd ever done in my life, the absolute and complete worst, was the time I was 10 and snuck out with Tommy the Butcher's son, and we stole a jug of sacrificial wine from the chapel down the street and drank it. I was sick as a dog. Tommy threw up. My headache the next day was so bad it felt like divine retribution, and honestly, it might as well have been. But really, that isn't the sort of thing that gets you dragged up before the Duchess. We have a vital question in the chat. For fan art purposes, is Chungus Bob's ship name Bungus or Chob?
I don't know, Bungus sounds amazing. Go with your heart.
Go with your heart. I'd never ever seen the Duchess close up. When she goes out for parades, there's always a crowd and a lot of guards around her. Bring the prisoner. How had this even happened? Who was the dead girl in the bakery? A large hand opened the door. It was attached to a guard. It was wearing shiny armor and looked very, very military. He reached the other hand inside the coach and made a beckoning gesture, then clicked his tongue, as if I were a dog. I looked at Constable Alphonse. He looked as bewildered and uncomfortable as me. There was another, slightly more impatient, tongue click. I held out an arm and was grabbed, not unkindly, but very firmly, and lifted out of the carriage. Inquisitor Oberon was tossing out orders on the other side of the courtyard. Most of them went by without making any sense. I caught the last one, though. Take the girl to a waiting room. She will be judged at the afternoon audience. I disliked judged only slightly less than I disliked prisoner. Actually, you know what? Come to think of it, I wasn't all that keen on girl either when it was delivered in that tone of voice. Girl. Aunt Tabitha is allowed to call me Go. Weird men in robes who think I murdered someone are not. The guard in the shiny armour took me through a pair of doors set in the wall of the carriage yard. It seemed really dark after the brightness outside, and the hand on my arm was hurrying me along, so all I saw was a blur of doors and corridors with shiny tile floors that clattered under my boots. The guards' feet didn't clatter. Maybe they wore soft-soled shoes so they wouldn't scuff the tile. Or maybe they took lessons in how to walk without sounding like they were wearing horseshoes. Prisoner for the afternoon audience, said the guard, holding my arm. There was that word again. I blinked a few times. My eyes had adjusted enough to see two more guards standing on either side of a small door. The door was bright blue. The guards were not bright blue, although the one on the right looked awfully grumpy. The guard on the left opened the door. The hand on my arm turned into a hand between my shoulder blades, which propelled me further into the room. It was small, nondescript, with a chair and a door opposite the one I'd come through. No windows. There was a small table and two wall sconces that provided light. And that was all. The door behind me started to close. Hey, I said, startled into protest. Hey, wait, what did I do? What do I do? You wait, said the grumpy guard. Someone will come for you, said the less grumpy guard. The door closed. I heard a loud clacking as it was locked from the other side. It probably says something about the difference between royalty and commoners, that they have waiting rooms that lock from the outside. Still, this could be worse, I told myself, looking around the featureless room. It's not the dungeon. There's a chair, and light, and no bars or rats or anything. The chair wasn't very comfortable. There was straw coming out of the seat, and it made sitting pokey, but at least it was a seat. They didn't give you seats in prison, did they? And sure, the doors are locked, but it's okay. It's not like you have to pee or anything. As soon as I thought it, I realized I'd made a mistake. You can't think that sort of thing without immediately having to go. Oh no. Well, it's not like I'd had a chance to go during all the confusion, and there was the carriage ride, which had not exactly been easy on the old bladder, and I'd had 2 cups of black tea this morning, and what goes in must come out, and... well, a quick search of the room proved there was no chamber pot. Neither were there ornamental vases, potted plants, or even a window to hang one's posterior from. Oh dear. I tried to ignore it. I counted the tiles on the floor, 46, if you counted each of the half tiles on the far wall as 1, and the rafters in the ceiling, 8, and then I counted them all again, just in case I'd missed one. I hadn't. Nobody came to get me. I counted everything again from the other direction. Extra rafters did not spontaneously leap into existence. Those 2 cups of tea, they were really starting to make themselves known. I wriggled in my chair. It poked me. At least in the dungeon they gave you a chamber pot, right? Or you just went in the corner. I eyed the corners of the room speculatively. Nah, somebody would notice. They already suspect you of murder. Let's not add public urination to the list. It was amazing. Terror cannot actually stand up to a full bladder. I was about to be hauled up on murder charges, and all I could think about was, oh God, I have to go so bad. I got up and pounded on the door. Hey, 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 I have to pee. Unlock the door. I rattled the handle futilely. There was a clattering in the lock, and the door opened an inch. A dark eye peered down at me. What's all this racket? I have to pee. I begged the guard. Please. Not my problem, said the guard, starting to close the door. Hey! Oh, come on, Jorge, said another voice. She's just a kid. Take her to the privy already. You take her, said Jorge, irritably, apparently, to the other guard. I'm eating breakfast. I didn't get a chance before work. Fine. A creak of leather, and the second guard pushed the door open. Jorge stomped back to his post on the far side. The new guard smiled in a friendly fashion. I'm pretty sure he had kids my age or something, and gestured in front of him. Come on, my girl, there's a privy down this way. Thank you, I said with heartfelt and genuine gratitude, and hurried out into the hall. He led the way. As we passed the surly Jorge, I glanced down at his lunch, which was black bread and cheese. You're feeling really dry, I suggested to the bread. Really stale. Hard as a rock. Usually I have to be touching something in order to make it do anything really impressive, but for just going stale, as long as I can see it, I can work with it. It wants to go stale. Bread is very accommodating that way. Then I scurried into the hall after my benefactor. The privy was a privy. There's a limit to what you can do with privies, even in a castle. Oh, there was a very nicely sanded seat. It was as nice as one could make it, but still, it's basically a board with a hole in it. That being said, I'm pretty certain I have never been so grateful for a board with a hole in it in my life.
The entire chat is saying, I have to pee.
On the way back, Jorge the guard was coughing and working his mouth, looking disgruntled. Apparently his bread and cheese hadn't agreed with him. I had very little time to savour my victory, however, because a minute after my guard had ushered me back into the waiting room, Inquisitor Oberon came back for me. Up, he said, gesturing with one hand. Again, people treating me like I was a dog. I had an urge to snarl and go for his ankles, but I couldn't see that it would improve the situation, although it would be satisfying. What's happening? I demanded, not getting up from my chair. He made the hand gesture again. His eyebrows drew together. I didn't quite have the nerve to disobey. I got up. What's happening? Where are you taking me? I could actually see him do it. I could actually see him weigh the annoyance of telling me against the annoyance of listening to me ask questions the whole way there. You have an audience to be sentenced for your crime, he said finally. I haven't done anything. Such is for the judges to decide. He beckoned again, and I got the impression that I had reached the end of his patience. So what could I do? I went. I'm just going to take a drink. You want to do another chapter? I mean, we do have to get that, right?
Yeah. Do we need to take a 2-minute break for everybody to get to go pee?
Everyone all right? Everyone near a bathroom?
His name was Ubertool.
Ubertool.
As opposed to Oberon.
Inquisitor Ubertool. Who I'm trying really hard to not make sound too much like Elias.
You're failing. The chat's noticed.
I figured.
Okay, please
I figured.
continue. You're fine with it. Everybody wants to continue pissing off Oberon, so please continue.
I expected the audience chamber to be huge, full of echoes and intimidation. I hadn't ever seen one, but it stood to reason it would be like that. Something built to the scale of the vast courtyard or the sanctuary of the great cathedral. Something like that. It was a bare room. And it was at a scale I could understand. Big, sure, but no bigger than, say, the common room of the tavern down the street. There were tapestries on the wall. They were beautiful, but it was a utilitarian sort of beauty. A ratty little man, dressed in a less dramatic shade of purple than the Inquisitor, sat behind a desk in the centre of the room. Behind him, at the far end of the room, sat a large table, and behind it, in a large padded chair that was definitely a chair and not a throne, sat a middle-aged woman that I recognized from past parades. The Duchess was about Aunt Tabitha's age and had much the same build, except that she was a good 6 inches shorter. Our ruler wasn't a warrior queen or a teenage princess or anything like that. We're not that kind of city. She was just a woman, rather pudgy, tired eyes, deep lines carved into her face. It's a funny thing, though, even having seen her in parades before, even seeing her now without the veil and thinking that she looked like a normal person, like somebody who might come into the shop and buy muffins, even that was no preparation for being in the same room with her. My knees felt like melting ice. My ears were ringing for no apparent reason. "We are hearing a case involving an occurrence at a bakery on Gladarat Street," said the little man in purple, in extremely bored tones. "Inquisitor Oberon, presenting report." There were several other people at the table, and I am embarrassed to say that I didn't see most of them. I had a vague impression of bodies and some guards behind the Duchess's chair, but the only other presence in the room that I really saw was a man in saffron broadcloth sitting next to the Duchess. I knew immediately who it was. Lord Ethan, the Golden General, the wizard who led Her Grace's armies into battle. Lord Ethan. He was famous. He had single-handedly won the Battle of Whitebarn, and they say when the Carrick's mercenaries were raiding the outlying farms a few years ago, he captured their leader and hung him upside down over a cliff edge in a fist made of clouds. Now, you may think that I'm being ridiculous, mooning over how famous a man is when I'm being accused of murder, but it was Lord Ethan. The closest we had to a living legend, like one of the heroes in the old stories who slew monsters. He had a chiseled jaw and wavy hair, the colour of melted butter, dark eyes like cinnamon, and broad shoulders. And look, I'm not doing this well at all, right? He sounds like a pastry when I do it. He looked heroic. Let's leave it at that. He looked like he should wear gleaming armour and carry a sword that sang. More than that, he looked nice. His lips were quirked up in a smile as he leaned to the Duchess and murmured something into her ear. I wished he'd speak to me. Didn't matter what. I'd like to buy a dozen blueberry scones. Would have been just as good as, "Follow me, we'll save the kingdom together." Better, in fact, because I at least knew what to do when somebody bought blueberry scones. It occurred to me suddenly that the Inquisitor was talking. He'd probably been talking for some time, but I'd been wool-gathering about Lord Ethan and scones. However, he'd just uttered the word murder, which is a remarkably good word for focusing one's mind. "This girl was found with the body," the Inquisitor continued, sounding bored. "I found the body," I burst out. "I wasn't found with the body." The man in purple gave me an annoyed glance that said very clearly that I was holding up the process. If I would just hurry up and be guilty, they could get this over with. By refusing to cooperate, I was wasting everybody's time. That made me angry. It might just be work to them, but it was my life. I buried my hands in my apron and clenched them into fists. "Found the body," said the Inquisitor with a sigh. "Very well. Obviously suspicion in this case is sufficient." "Excuse me," said a woman's voice. The Duchess was speaking. The Inquisitor looked startled. Did she not usually speak during these procedures? Was everything conducted between the two men in purple, and the Duchess just sat there? I'm 14. Politics aren't my strong suit. Still, that didn't seem right at all. "Tell me, child," said the Duchess kindly. "Do your parents know where you are?" "My parents are dead, Mum." "No, not Mum. You're talking to the Duchess, not a customer. Your Grace." "Do you have no family to live with, child?" "Oh, no. Yes, I do. I work for my Aunt Tabitha at the bakery, Your Grace. I actually lived in my own little room over the top of the glassblower shop, 6 doors down, because the bakery didn't have any spare rooms, and nobody thought it was a good idea to sleep in the basement with Bob." I spent 7 days a week at the bakery anyway, so it was nice to have somewhere else to go, and the room over the glass kilns was really nice and warm, if you didn't mind the occasional, shattering. And Aunt Tabitha was good friends with the glassblower's wife, and she brought me soup whenever I got sick. Now, all of this seemed entirely too complicated to explain to the Duchess. Fortunately, she didn't seem interested in asking any follow-up questions. She turned and consulted in a low voice with Lord Ethan. The Inquisitor's hand came down on my shoulder and squeezed so hard I jumped. I wondered if I dared to worm away. Would he hurt me? Would he do that in the presence of the Duchess? Would I look like a mistreated girl or a troublemaker? I clenched my fingers tighter in my apron and gritted my teeth. "Tell me, child," said the Duchess. "Are you a wizard?" "No, Your Grace. I mean, not a real wizard. Not like..." The Inquisitor's fingers dug brutally into my shoulder. I tore my eyes away from Lord Ethan and looked hopelessly at the Duchess. She smiled a little. I hadn't expected that. It gave me the courage to go on. "I can magic bread, Your Grace. Make dough rise, keep the muffins from burning, make sure they come out the pan clean. Just bread, though. I can't do anything but bread. Well, icing sometimes a little, but it's harder." I was babbling. I stopped. Lord Ethan leaned over and murmured in the Duchess's ear again. "Could your magic kill someone?" asked the Duchess. Her voice was quiet, but stern. "You must forgive me for asking, child, but you must understand. Those of us who have no magic do not always understand how it works, for those of you who do." "No!" I took a step forward involuntarily, and the Inquisitor had to release me or get dragged forward. I don't think either of us had expected that. I could feel him glaring at the back of my neck. But at least he wasn't squeezing the blood out of my shoulder anymore. "I mean, no, Your Grace, I don't. I mean, it's bread. How do you kill someone with bread?" Lord Ethan laughed and covered his mouth with his hand. I hoped that meant he agreed with me. The ratty man in purple rolled his eyes. "It is not the purpose of this inquiry," began the Inquisitor. "I think," said the Duchess in a carrying voice, "that in your, understandable zeal, Oberon, to get to the bottom of this rash of murders, you have mistaken an innocent bystander for one of the wrongdoers. Please release the girl, with our apologies." There was an exhalation of breath behind me, almost a huff, and then the Inquisitor stepped forward and bowed smoothly to the Duchess. "As Your Grace commands. My sincerest apologies for my error and for taking Your Grace's valuable time." She was letting me go. The Duchess was letting me go. She knew I was innocent, or Lord Ethan had told her. I pried my fingers out of my apron and tried to make a curtsy, realized too late that I was wearing trousers, and settled for an awkward bow. When I straightened, the Duchess was looking down at her papers and seemed to have forgotten that I existed. I stole a glance at Lord Ethan and met his eyes. He smiled at me, really honestly smiled, the Golden General, smiling at a bakery girl. My insides melted like butter. "Fine," said the Inquisitor over my head. He did not sound as if it was fine at all. He sounded nettled, in fact. It was surprising to recognize an emotion that shallow in his voice. He hadn't spoken in the entire trip, from the audience chamber to the outer hallway, and I had been too busy alternating between relief, I was free, they were letting me go, and elation, the Golden General noticed me, to say anything either. What happened next wasn't that surprising, I suppose, although it surprised the heck out of me. I got mad. "What? Fine, fine, that's it?" He looked at me. Really looked at me, instead of over me or through me or at some spot in the back of the inside of my skull for the first time since we'd reached the palace. "Did you expect something else, child?" One of the guards made a stifled noise. It occurred to me that I was talking back to an Inquisitor, a man who had just dragged me up in front of the Duchess, who probably could order me thrown in the dungeon for contempt of, I don't know, Inquisitors, or something, and the Mad went away and left the rest of me holding the bag. Could at least apologize, I mumbled. The Inquisitor's eyebrows went up. He leaned forwards, and for an instant I could see something dark and hot at the bottom of his eyes, like coals glowing in a dark oven. The Mad bit came back enough to lean forward in response, despite the fact that the rest of me was trying to cower away. This is not over, little witch. And then it was over, because the Inquisitor seemed to realize that standing toe-to-toe with a baker's girl was beneath his dignity, and he turned on his heel and stalked away. A guard grabbed my shoulder, shaking his head. My shoulder was beginning to get awfully tired of this treatment. I was going to have finger marks on that arm for days. "Don't know how lucky you are, Magica," he said ruefully, hurrying me down the hall. The Mad part of me did not want to let go of the matter quite yet, and really didn't like being called Magica in that tone of voice. But he opened the door and pushed me through it. "But you're free to go," said the guard. "I suggest you do go. Now," and shut the door. I stood there, and I stared at it for a while. I was at one end of the long courtyard we'd entered that morning. There were no carriages in the yard now. All the guards were pointedly not looking at me. I was a good 3 hours' walk from home, assuming I could find the right canal and follow it all the way. How dare they drag me all the way up here, find me innocent, and then not give me a ride back home? How dare they? I thought about bursting into tears. I mean, the Mad feeling had receded, and what it left was this hot, itchy feeling behind my eyes. Then there was a soft hiss and a familiar splattering, and I looked down at an increasing number of little grey splotches all over the pavement. It had started to rain. I had to walk home for hours through an unfamiliar part of the city in the rain. I began, rather absurdly, to laugh. This was ridiculous. Nobody could have luck this bad, could they? "At least they found you innocent," whispered the little voice in the back of my head. "That's pretty good luck, right there." I stopped laughing. Nothing to do with luck, I thought grumpily, folding my arms across my chest and stalking across the courtyard towards the distant carriageway. I was innocent. They didn't have a choice. "Are you sure about that?" This was too much, particularly on top of the rain. Of course they had to find me innocent. That the Inquisitor might have had the ability to find me guilty of a murder I hadn't committed wasn't something I wanted to think about. The rain started to come down with increasing enthusiasm. I paused at one side of the gateway. I was going to get soaked. I was already fairly soggy, and the rain was just getting warmed up. I looked back at the guards. They were donning oilcloth slickers. It didn't look like any of them were going to come over and offer me a carriage ride home. I was hungry. I was tired. I was mad. I was a very long way from home. The baking wasn't going to get done until I got there. If the baking didn't get done, well, it would be bad. I wasn't going to get any closer to home unless I started walking. So I gritted my teeth and started.
That sounds like a
And I think that's a good spot to leave it.